All right, we've been working our way through, this is session 23, the second part. In U.S. government, we've been working our way through the amendments to the Constitution. Last week, we finished up with Amendment 18, Prohibition, and what that looked like as far as selling, buying, producing, hauling, transporting, anything that had to do with alcohol was banned beginning in 1919. So let's jump to amendment number 19, which in August of 2020, a battle that had been going on since the 1800s concerning the right for women to vote was simply put into the Constitution as an amendment. When the Founding Fathers said in the Declaration of Independence that life, liberty, that all men are created equal, basically that's what it meant. It was all men. Women were not included in that because they had no right. As a matter of fact, in the beginning of the Declaration of Independence time, that early 1800s, there were places in the United States that women were not allowed to own property. But by the time we get to the middle to the latter part, after the Civil War, there began to be what was called the women's suffrage movement. And that had to do with women suffering under the very concept that the revolution was fought. No representation, no taxation without representation. And so by the time we get to the end of World War II, the movement in America had caused the constitutional amendment called women's suffrage to be passed and ratified by the states. This amendment gave women the right to vote for the first time across the board in the United States. Now, that was not just federal elections, but that was in any election that they began to have the right to vote. It was the first time in this country that women had the privilege to vote in any election. It added 26 million voters immediately to the election process. Now, one of the things that it also did was it caused anyone running for office to have to rethink their campaigns, because whoever could sway 26 million votes in 1930 or 1920 would win the election. And so that began to have to be put in place. Now, it's interesting because in the late 1800s, 1880s sometime, I think the first woman was elected to Congress. She was elected to Congress, but she couldn't vote in a public election. So a part of that was the move for all that, but it added 26 million voters into the election rolls in the 1920 election. Not everybody was in favor of it. There was a huge debate for all these years before it was finally approved. One of the craziest, if you want to look at what that looks like, one of the craziest arguments that was in place was this: if women are allowed to vote, it will lower the intelligence level of the voting population because women just don't understand and have the intelligence to know how to vote in an election. If you can imagine that. Now, again, we're filming this in 2023, so 103 years ago, your ancestors who were female for the first time were able to vote. That would have been an astounding change in the entirety of what it looked like to vote and be an American citizen. So that happened in 1920. On the top of the next page was Amendment 20, which we're now fast forwarding 13 years. We're now in the midst of the Great Depression, all the things that were going on. But there had been this thing in place concerning the election of the president, the vice president, the members of Congress, that the elections happened over here, but sometimes there was a long time frame from the time of the election till the time that they would assume office. And so the amendment number 20, which was voted on in 1933, set in place a set of guidelines for the timing of annual convening of Congress on a set time frame, the set date for the inauguration of the president and vice president, and the elimination of what was known as lame duck sessions of Congress. Basically, what happened was, if I'm elected over here, but I'm still going to be in office to here, there was a lot of stuff during this time frame that I didn't care about anymore because I wasn't going to be here. I'm not going to be a part of that. And I'm certainly not going to make rules that I'm going to have to go home and live with as a citizen rather than being someone who's in the Congress. And so it also set up the fact that if I'm pushing for something, if this is what I'm trying to get through Congress, but I only have this time, then during this time frame, I'm going to pursue it much more heartily or much more diligently, trying to get that passed. It also set in place that when the president and the vice president and Congress were elected the second Tuesday of November, by the way, that's set in the Constitution, all presidential federal elections are the second Tuesday of November. So we have that, and then you have Thanksgiving and Christmas and New Year's, which that whole time frame is basically a downtime for the federal government in many ways. As far as the lawmaking part of it, it is. So as soon as we come back in January, then we began to have the inauguration of the president. And so that set in place a precedent for what that would look like. Amendment number 21 was the only time in history that an amendment to the Constitution was overruled. Amendment 21, again in 1919, Amendment 18 was passed that banned alcohol in the United States. 14 years, the 21st Amendment was passed, which ended prohibition. While the social consciousness of the population had shifted on this issue, many felt the driving force with this amendment was the Great Depression. The concept of, hey, this sounds like a great idea, but because of prohibition, it spawned so much organized crime. The sale of alcohol was no longer being overseen, so the quality and the scary part of that was when you went underground and bought alcohol, you didn't have any idea what you were getting. Bootleg became a really big deal. The only good thing that came out of that was NASCAR, because NASCAR started back in the hills of Tennessee and Kentucky and Virginia and Arkansas and Louisiana, where the moonshiners then would load up cars and deliver them, and the guys that were delivering them souped up their cars so they could outrun the police. Ultimately developed a racing system, which now becomes NASCAR. But that's another story for another day. This amendment did away with the 18th Amendment. It superseded it. It also provided a very large tax base. Now, in the Great Depression, we see that people were out of work, people had no money. Now, when the federal government says we're going to allow this back in, but we're going to set standardized policies for that. When you go buy, for example, an alcohol, the government sets the percentage of alcohol or the level of alcohol that can be incorporated in it. If you go down and buy a beer, it's going to say on it X% alcohol. And so if you're wanting something different, then it has to be marketed as that, and it'll show you that. But not only did it allow for the overseeing of those productions to make sure the quality was there and that the quality was what it should be, but it also provided a tax base. We need more taxes so that the consumption of alcohol in the United States then could be taxed. The production of alcohol then could be taxed. The distribution of alcohol could then be taxed, and it would provide an income for the federal government during the Great Depression to help fund the government. And so that's what happened with the 21st Amendment. Now, in 1951, so we're now going from 33 to 51, something very unique had happened. And this was the 22nd Amendment. From the time of George Washington, it was a gentleman's agreement that no person would serve over 2 terms for president. After 2 terms, then you would not run again. But Franklin Delano Roosevelt served for 4 terms. He kept being reelected because there was no law against him. U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt had served 4 terms as the president. There had been almost 200 years of an understanding that the president would only serve 2 terms. Roosevelt died in 45. Now, Roosevelt was there for 16 years, or 12 years or 16 years as the president, through the Great Depression, through World War II, had walked through all of that. And after all of that, matter of fact, it's still a hot topic today because the president can only serve 2 full terms. Congress has never had that imposed upon them, and we've got people in Congress that have been there 40 years. And so there's a push, and has been talk at least, of putting term limits in place for Congress so that you don't end up with a career politician. Roosevelt in 1945 died. After 4 terms. So this was put in place to say no president can serve over 2 full terms. Now, that means this. If, for example, John F. Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, Lyndon Baines Johnson was his vice president, who was sworn in on that day on the way from Dallas to Washington to be the next president. He served out the rest of Kennedy's terms. In 1964, he ran for another 4-year term and was elected as president. He could have, and he chose not to, but he could have in 1968 run for a second 4-year term. So it's not saying that a president can only serve 8 years. It's saying he can only be elected to office for 2 full terms. When Nixon resigned in 1973, 74, whenever that was, or maybe it was 73, Gerald Ford, who was his vice president, became president. He then was elected to a term of office. He ran the second time, but was defeated. But in the midst of that, it says no person can run for president or vice president for more than 2 terms. Now, we have had a president, Adams, who was elected the president twice with the president in between them. But this amendment says in the country that we live in today that no one can serve over 2 terms in the office. Okay? Amendment number 23. When the country was set up, it was established with a federal city to be the seat of the government. It was the intent of our founding fathers not to put that city in a state where that one state would have a sense of unfair advantage over the other states when it came to the capital city. So Washington, D.C. was established as a District of Columbia, as an independent entity. It is not in any state. It is surrounded by 3 or 4 states, but it has its own local government, but it did not have a right to vote in any elections. And so we fast forward. In 1964, the 23rd Amendment was put in place that basically allowed the U.S. capital city to have a representation so that it would have a voice in the. Now, it's not a state. It's not the 51st state. It's simply the federal capital in Washington that is recognized to have the ability to have a vote. That happened in 1964. It now has a voice and a vote in the federal governing affairs of the nation. Okay? About 3 more and we'll be done for this session. Next page. Amendment number 24. Now, truthfully, these next amendments all happened, including that one, in which that I've been alive. But this next one happened in 1964. We know that the Reconstruction amendments of the 1860s, the doing away with slavery, the right of citizenship, and the right to vote were all put in place. I said at that time that there was nothing put in place concerning how states implemented the qualifications for a person to be able to vote. And so one of the things that happened, especially in some of our southern states, was the context of having to pay a tax, what was called a poll tax, P-O-L-L, poll tax, to be able to vote in an election. Because if you couldn't pay the tax, then you couldn't vote, which in fact eliminated a very large percentage of the poorer population because they simply didn't have the funds. during Lyndon Johnson, during his reign, he started the what was called the Civil Rights Act, which basically said there are things in place. It included the integration of schools that happened during those time frames. But this, dating all the way back to the end of the Civil War, some states had imposed poll taxes on anyone who wanted to vote. In some poor areas, many didn't have the ability to pay and therefore couldn't vote. This amendment mandated that no state could charge, collect, or use poll taxes in any federal election. It was ratified in 1864, part of Johnson's civil rights movement. Basically said, you cannot charge a poll tax for any federal election for any citizen. So in 64, it became mandated that anybody who was a citizen had the right to vote in any federal election. Okay? Amendment 25 in 1967. This one didn't really affect, and truthfully, it's never had to be used since it's in there. But there's an old saying, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And the context was this. Beginning in 1967, the 25th Amendment said this: the amendment was ratified to establish an orderly succession process for the presidency. In the event, in 1967, we were in the middle of what was called the Cold War. If you know, 1964, the United States and Russia almost went to war over missiles that were being erected, interballistic missiles that were being erected in Cuba, very to the brink that we literally almost ended up in a shooting war with Russia, in which probably, if it happened, the use of nuclear weapons would have been put in place. Now, having said that, what we then see is what happens in Washington if there's a sneak attack by an enemy, they drop a bomb, and the president and the vice president are both killed. Who assumes the role of office? So this amendment was put in place and put a successional idea and role of who would assume the presidency. If in an event a sitting president dies in office or is removed from office, by the way, that's happened multiple times. Johnson was removed from office. 5 presidents have been assassinated and died in office. 1 resigned. And so in the midst of that, what happens? It was set. The list begins with the vice president. If the president dies, then the vice president becomes the president. If the president and the vice president die, then it becomes the Speaker of the House, the Speaker pro tem of the Senate, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Treasury, and it walks all the way down through, all the way to the Secretary of Homeland Security. In the event of a crisis, a national crisis, when people are killed, the presidency simply, actually, through a process, rotates all the way through this to the assumption of who becomes the president of the United States. Again, this has never happened as far as going beyond the first step, which would be the vice president. Okay? Amendment 26. This one affected me personally because this was during the time that I was finishing up high school and turning 18 and going down. Up until 1971, to vote in a federal election, men or women, vote in a federal election, the legal age was recognized as being 21. If you were not 21, you could not vote. You weren't recognized as being a legal adult in the United States until you were 21. In 1964, really in 1959, but by the time we get to 65, 68, early 70s, hundreds of thousands of U.S. troops, men and women, were serving in Vietnam. 58 to 60,000 of them died for their country, and hundreds of thousands of them were wounded or disfigured and came home. Now, the concept was this: if I am an 18-year-old and old enough to put on a uniform that says the United States of America, bear arms for you, put my life on the line for you, and come home at 19 to 20 years old, and I'm not able to vote, that's simply not correct. And so the 26th Amendment was added in 1971, saying we're lowering the age of a legal adult from 21 to 18. And so I graduated high school in 1971. In 1972, as an 18-year-old, I actually voted in the presidential election that year, which would not have happened without the ratification of the 26th Amendment. Okay? Now, the 27th Amendment, which was the last one to be added, was added in 1992. And so that's been almost 30 years ago since it was added. Okay? The last amendment was ratified in 1992. It is perhaps the simplest amendment in the Constitution. It basically was put in place to say that no Congress could give itself an increase in pay. Up until that time, if Congress felt like they wanted a bigger salary, they wanted this, they wanted that, they simply voted on it and it was put in place. There was no accountability, there was no oversight. But in 1992, a law was passed, the 27th Amendment to the Constitution, that basically said this: if Congress determines that it's going to raise the pay level for congressmen, then that pay raise could not come into effect until the next congressional session. Boy, I'm having a hard time getting that out. Any raise voted by Congress for Congress could not take effect until the next congressional session, which meant some of those folks that were there wouldn't be there anymore. Now, here's the other thing. If I'm voting to give myself a raise and I'm about to be reelected, then I have to go home and face my constituents and explain to them why I think I deserved a raise, when many of those folks had not had a raise or were suffering. Okay, so that was put in place to do that. Now that's the end of all the 27 amendments, and that will finish up what we've been studying for this week. I will tell you this: next week there will not be a lecture, but there will be a semester final. That will be available to you on Tuesday of next week. It will cover all of the sessions we've had since the beginning of this semester in January. If you don't have your work turned in, here's what I will tell you. High school graduation is the 20th of May. I will finalize and turn everything in to the office to be published by the 20th. If I get anything from anybody, I don't care who you are, after that date, there will be a 0 turned in, and you will not be given credit for it. So if you owe something, get your work turned in, go to the portal, check and see what it is, go back and see the videos that you've skipped over or you haven't watched, and get all your work turned in, okay? All right. Enjoy your day. We'll see you next time.